I'm very excited to be here and to see so many of you. My children have been enjoying the snacks here. They are my support system. So I am here to talk to you today about poetry and entrepreneurship and seemingly other paradoxical pairings. More specifically, what I learned designing, launching, and running a poetry business. But in order to do that, I've got to give you a little bit of background about Black Radish Books. So before I began with Black Radish Books, I was part of something called the Dulce Chapbook Collective Exchange. And within this exchange, there were about 30 or so poets, and what we would do is we would write our chapbook, and a chapbook is basically a shorter length book, maybe 30 pages or less, usually doesn't have a spine. So we would all write a chapbook, and then we would exchange it with one of our partners, and our partner would be responsible for designing, producing, publishing, and distributing the chapbook to the other members and beyond. Now, this was a really exciting kind of format for us because it allowed us to bypass the usual channels of publishing, which can be very, very frustrating. And within those channels, what happens, an author writes their work, and then they send it off to publishers, not knowing what's going to happen to it sometimes, if anything happens to it at all. So participating in this particular endeavor allowed us to bypass that, and that was very exciting because we had control over our work. So based on my experience with the Dulce Chapbook Exchange, I wanted to do something a bit bigger. I wanted to do something that involved actual books with actual spines. And so I decided that I wanted to produce avant-garde work that might be a little bit too different, or a little bit too strange, or a little bit too weird. Still excellent work, but somehow not quite fitting the mold of what most publishers were doing. And so based on this, I contacted about 15 other poets. And what I did is I selected the poets not just based on their writing ability and their poetic sensibility, but on other skill sets that they possessed. Some of them possessed concrete kind of hard skills, like in web design or illustration or art. Others possessed more kind of social abstract skills, communicating, marketing, networking. And many of the poets actually possessed a number of these skills, and we even had one banker in the group, so that was, of course, very helpful. And so what we decided to do was to go forward with Black Radish Books. And we would be entrepreneurs in terms of what we brought to the collective. So we would also be carrying on with the proud tradition of self-publishing, which is something that many authors, poets have done traditionally at varying points during their careers. And here are some examples. We have Mark Twain, we have Margaret Atwood, and we have Edgar Allan Poe. So as entrepreneurs, we were going to carry forward and we were going to do things our way. We were going to do it ourselves, and we weren't going to wait around for other people to do it for us. One of the people who I invited to participate in Black Radish Books, and we were not yet named Black Radish Books, we would become named that later on, that's a different story, was Martha Reed, a poetry entrepreneur, co-founder, and managing editor of Black Radish Books up until April of this year when she died unexpectedly, and I lost a very good friend in the process. And she did not know I was going to be here today. I was within days of telling her that I was going to be giving a TEDx talk at Design Tech about publishing and poetry. And that's important because I would not be here were it not for her. She's the one who taught me that poetry can be entrepreneurship. So something to think about, and this didn't occur to me until a bit later, the parallels between poets and entrepreneurs. Not necessarily something we would always put together, but if we think about it, poets are like entrepreneurs. They have to be visionary. They face many setbacks, rejection, and failure. And rather than let that overwhelm them and stop, they use rejection and failure as their motivators to keep going and to keep doing interesting, newer things for a wider audience. And entrepreneurs are also a lot like poets in that they have to use the language of their discipline, right? Computer scientists use code. Fashion designers use fabric. Chefs use ingredients. They're using the language of their discipline in order to produce something new and interesting for the rest of the world, despite enormous risk. And so once I realized that poetry and entrepreneurship could go together, I went forward with Black Radish Books. Now, I wasn't going to go forward with Black Radish Books initially. After a few months of being a collective and trying to organize ourselves, we experienced some challenges. Initially, I knew there would be some challenges, but I thought for the most part it was going to be smooth sailing, right? I thought that based on nothing other than wanting that to be the case. But that's not how it worked out. It turns out that we didn't have a name for our group, Black Radish Books. It took us months to come up with this particular name. We were operating under the working name of We Make Books because we were making books. The problem was we didn't really know how to make books. We didn't have any experience with InDesign. We didn't have any experience with printing. We didn't have any experience with distribution. We didn't have, other than personally, much experience with marketing, social media, or getting our work out to reviewers. And so many members of the collective quit. And I, even though I began it, was almost one of them. But Martha Reed convinced me not to. And she did not know that she convinced me not to. We were talking about how the press was working, rather how it maybe wasn't working so much. And she said, Nicole, we need to make money. Now, before that, we had been operating somewhat as a nonprofit. We were able to produce a whole 3 books before we tanked. We ran out of money. People were fleeing. And she said, we need to make money. And I thought, that's interesting. Maybe poetry is a business. We'd been operating kind of business-y, business-ish, business-like, but not actually as a business, one that could make money, not just sustain ourselves so that we didn't go into poverty, which is a stereotype among poets, but actually make some money in the process. And so we got together, we re-architected the group, we created an advisory board, we diversified our poets for better inclusion and better representation. And from that, oops, here we go. Or not. Here we go, okay. From that, I learned the paradox of pairings, that sometimes the seemingly most paradoxical things that maybe seem like they shouldn't go together are maybe the very things that should go together, like poetry and money. So based on this, we were galvanized, we were excited to go. And we kind of had our act together, but we had an opportunity to publish this particular book, Kindergarten, Avant-Garde Poems, Plays, Stories, and Songs for Children, which would end up co-winning the Johns Hopkins Lion and Unicorn Award for North American Poetry in 2014. We still didn't have money to produce this, even though things were getting better. So what we did, and this is something that you can do with your endeavors, is we went to crowdfunding. We did a Kickstarter, a month-long campaign. Our goal was to raise $4,000. Publishing anthologies is a fairly expensive process, and sending them out is also a pretty expensive process compared to other types of books. But we crowdfunded it through Kickstarter, and we ended up making $12,000. And this allowed us to send this book throughout the United States, down to South America, over to Europe and Asia, even to Australia. So suddenly our exposure broadened because we hadn't waited around for other people. We did it ourselves. And in doing this, the people at Johns Hopkins saw this and then granted us this award. And so this leads me to my next point about production literacy. And this for me might be the most important thing that I have learned about the 21st century, that it is not enough to just create. Creating is excellent, it is active, but it's not enough. We cannot wait around for someone to publish, produce, or distribute our work. That's a one-way process, it's passive. And it's not true literacy. True literacy occurs when all actors are participating in the entire process. To be successful, we must initiate production, participate in the entire process, both ways, all ways, which is true production literacy, and that is active, active. Now this applies in business, it certainly applies in tech, but it also applies to poetry. And it also applies potentially to other liberal arts kinds of studies. So I've given you the example of Black Radish Books, and there are plenty of other presses that are doing likewise, that are doing something similar. But I also want to call your attention to poetry and other capitalistic endeavors. Here we have the haiku guys and gals. The haiku guys and gals are a business made up of poets, specifically haikuists, and they are paid to write poetry. What they will do is they will go to a birthday party, for example, or they'll go to a wedding reception, or they'll go to the opening of a business, and they will write poetry for the guests. They are paid to write poetry. They are legitimate, profitable business. Who would have thought that? So in addition to the haiku guys and gals, we also have the enterprising Brian Sonia Wallace. Brian Sonia Wallace has a corporate sponsorship to be a poet. When we think of corporate sponsorships or endorsements, we tend to think of famous athletes or celebrities. We're not necessarily thinking of poets. But what he has been selected to do and makes money doing is he sits in the Mall of the America in Minnesota, giant mall, and his people are buying their smoothies, as they're buying their sleeping bags, as they're buying their perfume, as they're buying their pretzels, they can buy a poem from Brian Sonia Wallace. So poetry can be a capitalistic endeavor. It is a commodity, and it's an important commodity. And so my final takeaway for this presentation would be this. There are people who are going to tell you that you should or should not do something based on profit. You should do this because it's going to make money. You should not do this because it's not going to make money. And historically, to some degree, that's been supported. But that doesn't have to be the case. Poetry can be profitable. Unusual pairings do happen. And I hope that as you are going forward, you find those unusual pairings and you make them happen. Thank you very much.